This is Shalom World Podcast.
Uniquely to Hebrews, Jesus is not just the sacrifice, but he's also the priest, the one who offers the sacrifice. Hello and welcome back to Voyage. I'm Richard Ounsworth and I'm speaking to you from Holy Cross Priory, the Dominican Priory in Leicester. And we've been looking at the letter to the Hebrews. In our last session, we got through the whole of chapter 8, which is quite short, and we're a little way into chapter 9, which is long and very difficult. And you may remember the last verse that we looked at was this. By this, the Holy Spirit indicates that the way into the sanctuary has not yet been disclosed as long as the first tent is still standing. This, you'll remember, being a reference to the ceremonies of Yom Kippur and the fact that only the high priest was allowed to go into the Holy of Holies, also known as the second tent, through the veil of the temple or curtain. Only the high priest, only once a year, only on the day of Yom Kippur. The first tent, by implication, is in some sense in the way of the second tent. With this exception of the high priest, you can't see the second tent, you can't get at the second tent, because the first tent is, physically speaking, in the way. The first tent, the priests go in and out all day long doing their business, but the second tent is, with that small exception, basically shut off. And Hebrews is suggesting to us that this is a symbol the Holy Spirit is indicating. As I was thinking about this in the break between our recording sessions, I was reminded of a passage in St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 10, where he speaks about some events in the wilderness. And he says that these things happened to them, but they were written down for our instruction, upon whom the end times have come. St. Paul, and I think also the author of the letter to the Hebrews, recognize that very often what we read about in the Old Testament, though it happened hundreds, maybe thousands of years ago, and was written hundreds of years ago, was written for us. It is only with the hindsight of knowing Jesus from inside, as it were, the Christian perspective, that we can actually see what all this stuff is really about. And he goes on to say, this is a symbol of the present time, during which gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshipper. A symbol, the Greek word there is parabole, a parable. The existence of these two tents, and in particular, the continued existence of the first tent and its being in the way, is a symbol of the present time. The present time, then, it seems to me, must be, from the point of view of the author of Hebrews, a time when the temple sacrifices are still going on, or at least, if the temple has been destroyed, as I mentioned might have been a possibility in our last episode, it's being assumed that they're going to resume again fairly soon. And after all, that would have been the assumption that most of the people of Israel would have made. The temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians. In the fullness of the time, it was rebuilt. Now the temple has been destroyed by the Romans. Surely, in the fullness of time, it will be rebuilt. I don't think anybody could have imagined in the year 70, 71, 72 AD that still, 2,000 years nearly later, there would be no temple. So the existence of these two tents symbolizes the present age and then, by implication, the age to come. And the age to come is the age of the new covenant. Here we come across something I've already spoken about, I think, briefly, which is what we call realized eschatology. That is to say, the idea that, in one sense, the future is already present. In the person of Christ, and especially in his death and resurrection, a new creation has come about. A new age has dawned. St. Paul talks about how the night is far gone and the day is at hand. We live in the new age, the age of the new covenant. And yet, from another point of view, that age is still to come. There is still something to be achieved. We Christians live in a tension between the already and the not yet. And I think some of that tension, we theologians like to call it eschatological tension because we like our long words, that tension is reflected in this idea that the present age still exists, even though we Christians in some way already live in the future. Notice he says then, in the present time, gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshipper. He goes on to say, but they deal only with food and drink and various baptisms, regulations for the body, until the time comes to set things right. So he's talking here about the rituals of Judaism. By baptisms, he doesn't mean Christian baptism. He means ritual washings, which were purification rites that the Jewish people enjoyed, and the regulations about food and drink, the continued observance, at least, of the Mosaic covenant by the people of Israel. That is, in one sense, the present time. But, he goes on, when Christ came as a high priest of the good things that have come, so in one other sense, they have already come, even though the old order still obtains, as a high priest of the good things that have come, then, through the greater and perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy place, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. So here we have a summary of that whole idea of Christ as being the one who fulfills the type that is established by the role of the high priest on the Day of Atonement. Remember, the high priest performs the sacrifice, which deals with the ritual profanation caused by the unintentional sins of the people. He performs the sacrifice, he takes the blood, he goes into the holy place, and through the holy place into the Holy of Holies. But Jesus is the great high priest, the high priest of the good things that have come, that is, of the new covenant. He goes not into a tent made by human hands, not a tent of this creation at all, but the greater and perfect tent. That is the tent on which Moses modelled the tent of meeting, as was referred to in chapter 8. The greater and more perfect tent is heaven itself. Jesus Christ entered into heaven itself. And he entered not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. The blood of the sacrifice is what the high priest needs in order to be allowed to go through the veil of the temple into the Holy of Holies. It's made clear in the book of Leviticus that if the high priest or anybody else approaches the Holy of Holies without that blood or on any other day, then he will die. Jesus needs his own blood as, so to speak, an entrance visa, a passport which permits him to enter not into that earthly Holy of Holies, but into heaven itself. And we are told by doing this, he obtained eternal redemption. What's the logic of that? Well, he's going to go on and explain it now. For if the blood of goats and bulls, with the sprinkling of the ashes of a heifer, sanctifies those who have been defiled, so that their flesh is purified, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to worship the living God? So notice at the heart of the logic here is the fact that Jesus is divine. He offers the blood of an unblemished sacrifice, the unblemished sacrifice of his own body, which is united to the second person of the Trinity. His whole human nature is united to the second person of the Trinity in a single divine person. Jesus offers that sacrifice through, we are told, the divine, the eternal Spirit. And because Jesus is who he is, when he offers this sacrifice, it's so much more efficacious than the sacrifice offered under the Old Covenant. Those sacrifices merely dealt with surface realities, with externals. But Jesus, as God, is pure spirit, and as such is able to deal with spiritual, eternal realities. The blemish, not a ritual blemish or a physical blemish caused by sin, but the blemish on our very souls, a spiritual blemish, an eternal blemish. It's not just our awareness of sin, but our consciences that are permanently made clean. And he goes on to imply through that we are actually able for the first time to offer genuine worship, not just external works, not just rituals, but the worship of mind and heart. One's reminded here of what Christ said to the woman of Samaria: the time will come when people will worship God not on this mountain nor in Jerusalem, but in spirit and in truth. That promise of Christ has now been made a reality, possible through the offering of himself as a divine person, able to make a sacrifice of his human life. For this reason, he goes on to say, he, Jesus, is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, because a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions under the first covenant. So here he harks back to what we spoke about in our last session, the new covenant promised by Isaiah. And although it's not made explicit, there is once again this notion that there's an analogy between the first tent and the second tent, and the old covenant and the new covenant. Jesus has entered through the first tent into the second tent. He's gone through the old covenant. That is to say, he's fulfilled it. He's fulfilled all of its conditions, and therefore he is able to enter into and inaugurate, if you will, this new covenant which was promised by the prophet Jeremiah, but of course, therefore, really by God. So we receive the promised eternal inheritance. That's entry into God's rest, as I spoke about last time and dealt with at some length when we looked at chapter 4. An inheritance not just of a geographical land, the land of Canaan, but of heaven itself. That is our eternal inheritance. And that's because the death has occurred that redeems us from the transgressions under the first covenant. All of that is dealt with, and we can definitively move on. Now, the next bit is a difficult argument to follow, so I'll read it slowly and then I'll try to explain what I think he's saying. Where a will is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. So far, so good. Obviously, when you make a will, it doesn't come into effect till you're dead. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. Hence, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. Now, why is he suddenly talking about wills? That's the question that's on everybody's lips. In Greek, the word for will, as in your last will and testament, is diatheke. And that is also the word used in the Greek translation of the Old Testament for covenant. So covenant and will are the same word. What Hebrews is suggesting to us is that just as a will made by a human being needs a death in order for it to come into effect, so a covenant, which is a will made by God, needs a death to come into effect. And indeed, in the Old Covenant, there were deaths. The animal sacrifices that took place were the deaths that made that covenant an ongoing reality. But you might say to yourself, and if you do, you won't be the first, hang on a minute, that's cheating. With a will, it's not just anybody's death that makes the will come into effect. It has to be the death of the one who made that will. And of course, in the case of the new covenant made by God with us in Christ, that is precisely what has come to pass. God in Christ died for us on the cross, and thus his will, the new covenant, comes into effect. But in the old covenant, God didn't die. Does that mean Hebrews' logic is completely faulty? I don't think so. I think we're supposed to notice this, that God didn't die. What does that mean? It means, first of all, that the old covenant was always, in some sense, faulty or partial or only valid in as much as it pointed beyond itself to the new covenant. And that touches on what I spoke about in our last session about supersessionism, the good kind and the bad kind. But I also think that the sacrifices that took place under the old law were, in a certain sense, a symbolic death. I mean, they were literal deaths, of course they were, but they were also symbolic deaths. But whose death did they symbolize? It might seem at first glance as though it was those who were making the sacrifices, the ordinary Israelites who brought their animals to the temple or earlier on to the tent of meeting to make their sacrifices. Wasn't it their deaths that were being symbolized? In some sense, perhaps yes. But we need to remember that the Jewish people knew when they were performing these sacrifices, they weren't really giving God anything. You might speak as though you are making an offering to God, that you're giving him something. But the people of Israel know full well you can't actually give God anything. It's completely impossible. God is God. So if, when we do these sacrifices, we are not giving God anything, where is the sacrifice? In a certain sense, even then, it was not us giving something to God, but God giving himself to us. God making a down payment of his own death that was to take place on the cross in the deaths of all of those animals that took place in the sacrificial system of the tent of meeting and later on of the temple. So he goes on to say, not even the first covenant, I beg your pardon, was inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment had been told to all the people by Moses in accordance with the law, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop, and sprinkled both the scroll itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant that God has ordained for you." And that's what we read about in the book of Exodus, in the story of how, when he's come down from Mount Sinai, when he's erected the tent in accordance with God's will and his law, then he does indeed inaugurate the tent as the place where the covenant takes its life from, as the place where the covenant is continually renewed by these sacrifices. Moses inaugurates the covenant by using this blood to sprinkle everything. So the sprinkling of blood is a kind of inauguration and a kind of renewal. And in order to obtain that blood, there has to be a sacrifice, an animal sacrifice, a death. But that blood, symbolically speaking, represents not the life of the animal being poured out as a gift to God, but the life of God being poured out as a gift for Israel. Here I'm reminded of what the Jewish crowd said to Pontius Pilate, when Pontius Pilate said, "Do you want me to kill Jesus?" And according to St. Matthew's Gospel, they replied, "His blood be upon us and upon our children." Now that verse has been used very badly over a lot of the last 2,000 years as a way of suggesting that all Jewish people are guilty of the death of Christ and should be punished for it. That kind of wicked misinterpretation is completely unacceptable to a good Christian. What it means is not, we, on behalf of all of our children, accept the guilt of Jesus' blood. That may be what those particular Jews thought they meant. But actually, what they were saying, whether they knew it or not, is we would like to be purified by the blood of Christ. May his blood be poured out for us to save us, just as our ancestors had the blood of the old covenant sprinkled upon them to draw them into that old covenant. So that, I think, is what's going on in this passage when Hebrews reminds us about the inauguration of the first covenant. He goes on to say, in the same way, he sprinkled with the blood both the tent and all the vessels used in worship. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. I'm sure also when Hebrews quotes this passage from Exodus, it will be conscious of how Jesus echoed this passage at the Last Supper. Moses said, "This is the blood of the covenant, which is ordained for you." Jesus at the Last Supper said, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for you." So clearly also there's a Eucharistic overtone to this passage, and I think that's quite important. There's not a lot of explicit Eucharistic theology in the letter to the Hebrews, but actually when you read between the lines, you find the Eucharist all over the place, I think. We come to chapter 9, verse 23, and I often say to my students, I think this is actually the most difficult verse in the whole of the New Testament to understand. Certainly much ink has been spilt on it, and it goes like this. "Thus it was necessary for the sketches of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves need better sacrifices than these." The problem, of course, is the idea that heaven needs to be purified. That seems very, very odd indeed. We can understand how in the Old Covenant, things that were taken from the ordinary realm and dedicated for use in the sacred sphere needed to be purified, they needed to be consecrated, and that consecration might take place by the sprinkling of blood. And also we can see how blood was used almost literally as a cleansing agent. Not actually literally, because you'll find when you smear blood all over things, they don't get any cleaner, they get dirtier. But ritually speaking, they do get cleaner. The wiping of blood onto things was a way of symbolically wiping off the effects of sin, the infection caused by sin. So blood acts as a kind of ritual detergent. But it surely can't be the case that this is what takes place in heaven. It makes no sense to think of heaven being cleansed, having its filthiness removed. Now, some people have suggested that this is a reference to the casting out of Satan from heaven, perhaps Satan and all the fallen angels that took place at the very beginning of time with the fall of Satan. But I don't think that's right. I don't think there's any suggestion here that that's what he's talking about. There's no hint that Satan is involved anywhere in this. All the hints have been about the inauguration of a covenant. And I think it's that word inauguration that's key. When Moses inaugurated the first covenant, he used blood to make the tent of meeting that he had constructed into the locus of the covenant. I'm deliberately using this word locus. It's just a Latin word for place, but it captures a sense in which the covenant is, you might almost say, anchored to that place. That place is to mix metaphors dreadfully, the wellspring of the covenant, and it needs to be inaugurated. That splashing of blood that Moses did in and around the tent of meeting at the foot of Mount Sinai was like a ribbon-cutting ceremony that you might have when a local supermarket is opened, or you might see the King of England going and pulling a little curtain open in front of a plaque. It's that kind of thing, the official opening or inauguration of the covenant. The implication of the verse that I've just read is that although heaven was always heaven, it's now become something new. It has had better sacrifices than these take place for it to provide the blood that is necessary for it to be inaugurated as the locus of the new covenant. Jesus' death is this better sacrifice, the sacrifice which is not of a dumb animal that has no choice in its death, the sacrifice not even of an ordinary human being, not that God would ever command such a horrific thing, but the sacrifice of God himself in the person of Jesus Christ to show his perfect love and to pour out blood that is united with the divine, so that that blood can finally and definitively inaugurate a new covenant which finds its locus, its place, its wellspring, its anchor point, call it what you will, not in any earthly location at all, but in the very heavens. And so he goes on, and really he's almost repeating himself here. For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made by human hands, a mere copy of the true one, but he entered into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. That's almost just repeating himself, as I said, except that he does add one thing, which I think I spoke about 2 or 3 episodes ago, which is the idea that Christ, now having entered into the heavenly sanctuary, can appear there on our behalf. He is interceding for us before the throne of God. Remember how the first letter of John speaks about Christ as our advocate appearing before the throne of God in heaven. That's what's going on. So there's a sense in which Christ's sacrifice has a once-for-all effect. He's performed his sacrifice, he's entered into the heavenly sanctuary, done. But there is a sense in which there is still work for Jesus to do. And the work that Jesus is now continuing to do is precisely appearing before the throne of God, pleading for us, interceding for us, taking our humanity into the presence of God to stand there on our behalf. And he goes on, nor was it to offer himself again and again, as the high priest enters the holy place year after year with blood that is not his own. Notice again, we've seen this already, the contrast between once for all and repeated. It's a contrast that you find in a lot of ancient texts, not just in the Jewish tradition, but in pagan traditions as well, that something that happens once and for all is always superior to something that has to be repeated over and over again. Something that is definitive is always better than something that needs to be repeated. And how much more true is that of the once-for-all sacrifice of Jesus? Jesus did not offer himself again and again, like the high priest entering the holy place, so we're back to Yom Kippur, for then he would have had to suffer again and again since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the age to remove sin by the sacrifice of himself. So Jesus is once for all. He can be once for all because he is the eschatological sacrifice. Remember that word, which means to do with the end of time, the end of all things, the final goal of human history. Jesus, in some sense, brings human history to a close so there can be no more repetition. And therefore, Jesus' death brings sin to an end. That doesn't mean, of course, that you and I don't sin. We do. And when we sin, by going to confession, we appropriate for ourselves, through the sacramental ministry of the church, the power of Christ's once-for-all sacrifice. When the priest says the words of absolution, we are once more standing at the foot of Calvary, and the blood of Christ that poured from his right-hand side is once more flowing out over us, reconsecrating us, giving us once again the gift of forgiveness that is attained by that once-for-all sacrifice. The contrast that's being implied here also is that the sacrifices of the old law only ever dealt with the effects of sin, and in particular, in fact, with the ritual effects of sin. The ritual effects of sin is that by the sins you have committed, whether intentionally or not, and indeed not just sins, but other transgressions under the law which are not morally wrong, all of these things render you ritually impure, and you need to be made pure once again by the sacrificial system. But with Christ's sacrifice, because it's once for all, because it's eschatological, because Jesus is God, because he offers himself willingly as a perfect demonstration of the divine love, his sacrifice deals with sin, not just the effects of sin, but sin itself. We can go so far as to say that sin is put to death by Christ. The effects of sin that we feel in our own lives as Christians, those effects, they're just aftershocks, if you will. You know how when there's an earthquake, then for a little while afterwards there'll be smaller earthquakes that follow on, and we call those aftershocks. It's almost as if death has been put to death, sin has been destroyed, but its corpse is still twitching. But we have nothing to be afraid of from death because it is dead. We have nothing to be afraid of from sin because Christ has dealt with it once for all by his sacrifice. And as long as we cling to him and allow the blood of his sacrifice to flow over us and in us and through us by our participation in the sacramental life, we have nothing to fear from then. Just as, he goes on to say, finishing this chapter, just as it is appointed for mortals to die once, and after that the judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. At the very end of this chapter, we get actually the first mention in the whole of the letter to the Hebrews of the second coming. So much of the letter to the Hebrews deals with what Christ has already achieved. You'll remember I spoke about eschatological tension, the already and the not yet. And much of the emphasis in Hebrews, 99% perhaps of the emphasis is on the already, what Christ has already achieved for us by his death. And that's what I've just been talking about. But that doesn't mean that we are at the end of human history yet. Already we exist in the new creation, but we are still waiting for Christ to come again in glory to judge the living and the dead. He's already been offered to bear the sins of many, but he will appear a second time to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. But we would have to say, of course, that the only way in which a Christian can be eagerly waiting for Christ is if we are confident that our sin has already been dealt with. Now, as I've already said, that doesn't mean that we are certain we never sin. Which of us is certain of that? What it means rather is that we are certain that we are forgiven. We are absolutely confident in the love of God for us shown through Christ and his cross, a love that is more powerful than sin, more powerful than death. If we are confident in that, then we place ourselves already in the loving arms of the Father, and we have absolutely nothing to fear. Nothing to fear from death, and certainly nothing to fear from the second coming of Christ. We will not have to look busy. We will not have to hide under the rocks or dive into the sea to escape from him, futile though that will be, because we know that he is coming for us as the one who loves us to save us from death. That brings us to the end of this 9th chapter of the letter to the Hebrews. So we'll draw this episode to a close. I hope things have been reasonably clear in an explanation of what is, I'm sure, the most difficult chapter in the whole of the New Testament. Next time, we'll have a look at chapter 10 of the letter to the Hebrews. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching Voyage.
Thank you for joining us today. We'd like to hear what you thought of today's session. Share your feedback with us at podcast@shalomworld.org. You can motivate and support us today. shalomworld.org/donate. Visit shalomworld.org for more information about Shalom World Podcasts. To get the latest updates, make sure you follow us on Instagram at Shalom World Podcasts. Shalom World Podcasts is now available on all online platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and others.